the flickering candlelight of a vast stone chapel, a little girl stood draped in silks heavier than her frame. Her name was Isabella of France, daughter of the most powerful king in Europe. She was just 12 years old, and already being traded like gold. Paris, 1308. The bells of Notre Dame rang solemnly, but this was no ordinary Sunday Mass. Inside the royal palace, King Philip IV of France, known across Europe as Philip the Fair, paced like a lion. His court was rich with ambition and cruelty. This was a king who had crushed the Knights Templar, seized their treasure, and silenced dissent with blood. He ruled not just as a monarch, but as a weapon of state. And now he was marrying off his daughter for peace. Isabella was his only surviving daughter, born into privilege but also a life that was never her own. At barely 12, she already understood her duty, to secure a fragile alliance between France and England. England was ruled by Edward I, a war-hardened king known as the Hammer of the Scots. But he was old and dying. His son, Edward of Caernarfon, was next in line. A handsome, tall man, but one who lived in scandal. Whispers echoed even in the French court. He loves his male favorite more than any woman. Still, politics demanded sacrifice. Isabella was promised to Edward, the soon-to-be King of England. The marriage contract was signed with the ink of diplomacy, not affection. Isabella would bring a generous dowry, French lands and titles, and the prestige of Capetian blood. In return, she would be Queen of England. But Isabella's mother, Queen Joan I of Navarre, died when she was young, and so she had no protector. Her father saw her only as an asset, to be exchanged and forgotten. As the ceremony was arranged, Isabella was adorned in golden cloth, her eyes large with confusion beneath her veil. The French court called her the she-wolf's cub, unaware how prophetic that title would one day become. The wedding took place at Boulogne on January 25, 1308. Dignitaries lined the cathedral. The scent of incense mingled with fresh-cut roses. But the English king-to-be arrived not alone. He came with his lover, Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight with swagger, wit, and the king's heart in his palm. On the very night of the wedding, instead of honoring Isabella, Edward spent most of the celebration showering jewels, titles, and land on Gaveston. Never had a queen been so dishonored at her own coronation feast, wrote one chronicler. Worse still, Edward handed over Isabella's wedding gifts, jewels from France, to Gaveston. The French nobles were insulted. Isabella was humiliated. From the very beginning, Edward made it clear: Isabella was a queen in name only. Medieval chroniclers, particularly Thomas Walsingham and Jean Froissart, record the scandal with barely hidden disgust. Gaveston, they wrote, dressed in bright silks, mimicked courtly manners, and mocked Isabella's French accent and traditions. He called her the little frog, while Edward laughed. Yet Isabella never openly wept. She smiled, bowed, and watched, and waited. Even as a child, she had learned that survival in court meant silence, for now. Back in England, Edward's favoritism caused political chaos. Nobles were furious that Gaveston held power, land, and even military command. Parliament began to turn against the king. As tensions rose, Isabella, still barely in her teens, became a pawn in a tug-of-war between Gaveston's ambitions and the angry lords of England. Eventually, in 1312, the barons captured Gaveston. He was executed without trial, his body left mutilated on a hill outside Warwick. Edward was devastated, but he blamed no one more than his own wife. To him, Isabella represented the French royal family who had secretly supported the barons, and so began a cold war between husband and wife. Isabella gave birth to her first son, the future Edward III, in 1312. The child secured her place at court, but not her safety. Edward II, grieving Gaveston, withdrew emotionally and politically. He left Isabella isolated with few allies, but she began building quiet relationships with key noble families. She was observing the rot, preparing for what might come next. Unfortunately for her, the worst was still to come. By 1318, another man entered Edward's inner circle, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Ruthless, manipulative, and obsessed with power, he quickly surpassed even Gaveston in the king's affections. But unlike Gaveston, Despenser was a predator, not just politically, but, as many chronicles claim, sexually. He would become the shadow ruler of England and Isabella's personal tormentor. The girl, once traded for peace, had grown into a woman surrounded by enemies. She had been humiliated at her wedding, discarded in her own palace, and watched the rise of a man far more dangerous than her husband's first lover. But Isabella was no longer a child, and she would not be powerless forever. England had gained a queen, but not a love story. While the people celebrated, their king offered his heart to another, not to his bride, but to a man whose very presence would shake the throne. Long before Isabella crossed the English Channel, Edward had already chosen his heart's companion, Piers Gaveston. Piers was no ordinary knight. Of Gascon origin, he was flamboyant, confident, and well-read. Some said he was beautiful. Others said he was arrogant. But one thing was certain: Edward adored him. They had met when Edward was still a prince. King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, noticed how much his son favored Gaveston and grew concerned. He tried to separate them. In 1307, he banished Gaveston from England. But soon after the old king died, Edward II's first act as king was to recall Piers, restore his lands, and name him Earl of Cornwall, a title usually reserved for royal blood. The court was shocked. Nobles seethed. To them, Gaveston was a commoner, an outsider, an intruder, and worse, the rumors spread. He is not merely a favorite. He is the king's lover. When Isabella arrived in England at age 12, she was expecting to be queen, consort, and mother to the heir. Instead, she became an ornament, sidelined while her husband lavished attention on Gaveston. During their joint coronation in 1308, it was not Isabella who shone, but Piers. He wore silk garments more luxurious than even the king's. At the feast, Edward sat beside him, laughing, whispering, while Isabella sat alone. The French nobles were outraged. Chroniclers from the Capetian court wrote, "The queen was cast aside like an afterthought. To make matters worse, Edward gave her wedding jewels to Gaveston. Those same pieces had been part of her dowry from France, family heirlooms. In Isabella's eyes, it was a symbolic theft, not just of property, but of her dignity. And still, he endured, silently. Gaveston mocked everyone. He invented nicknames for powerful barons, calling one the Black Dog and another the Simpleton. He performed plays ridiculing them, with Edward watching in amusement. But the nobles were not amused. One by one they formed alliances. Thomas of Lancaster, Humphrey de Bohun, and others, and demanded action. They insisted Edward send Gaveston into exile again. In 1308, under pressure, Edward reluctantly agreed, but even in exile, Gaveston lived like a king, in Ireland, where Edward made him Lord Lieutenant. That same year, Isabella gave birth to a daughter who tragically died young. Still, her position was growing. Her French lineage gave her power, even as her husband continued to ignore her. Edward couldn't stay away. In 1309, he recalled Gaveston again, openly defying Parliament and enraging the barons. England trembled on the edge of civil war. In 1311, the barons forced Edward to accept the ordinances, a list of restrictions, including the permanent exile of Gaveston. But Edward had other plans. By 1312, Gaveston returned once more, secretly. Isabella, by then 17, was not consulted. The Queen's humiliation had become routine. The nobles, furious, acted quickly. Gaveston was captured by the Earl of Warwick and others. He was executed without trial, his body desecrated and dumped on a remote hill. Edward was inconsolable. He wore mourning black for months. His fury was volcanic. He threatened civil war, executions, vengeance. But he never turned that rage toward the men who had embarrassed him most. Instead, he turned cold toward Isabella. To him, her French relatives had allowed this. Her father, Philip IV, had refused to intervene. The French court, in his eyes, had supported the barons. He began to distrust Isabella, to isolate her, limit her presence in council, and eventually cut off access to political influence. She was now not only unloved, but watched. In 1312, Isabella gave birth to Edward of Windsor, the future Edward III. This child secured her future, for a time. A queen who bore the male heir was harder to discard. Yet Edward's affections remained elsewhere. He began to cultivate new favorites. The court whispered once again. Isabella, though still very young, began learning court politics. She was not merely enduring. She was recording. Every betrayal, every insult, every humiliation. She was preparing. Then came the most dangerous man of all, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Unlike Gaveston, who loved Edward but mocked the court, Despenser was ruthless, calculated, and hungry for absolute power. He had no interest in peace, only domination, and his rise would mean the Queen's fall into fear, surveillance, and eventual imprisonment. Isabella's nightmare was about to begin, far worse than anything she had known with Gaveston. The Queen had suffered the indignities of a forgotten bride, the heartbreak of public rejection, and the shame of being replaced again and again. But a colder evil now stalked the palace, one who would not simply humiliate her, but control her very life. The she-wolf was about to be caged.